story in the comments and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was still dark when the knock came. Not loud, careful, the kind of knock that waits for permission. I remember opening my eyes and thinking, for a brief, confused moment, that I was back in my old house years earlier, when the kids were small and bad dreams traveled faster than morning light. I pulled on a sweater and patted down the hallway. The floor was cool, the air carrying that early morning quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. When I opened the door, my son stood there, fully dressed, shoes in his hand, hair still damp like he just rinsed his face to wake himself up. He looked older in that moment, not just grown, but tired in a way I recognized too well. "Mom," he said softly, "can we talk?" Those 4 words landed heavier than any argument ever had. I stepped aside without thinking, and he walked in, glancing around the living room like he hadn't grown up there. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Outside, the sky was just beginning to fade from black to deep blue. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee for myself and made tea for him, the way I used to when he studied late in high school. Our hands almost touched when I slid the mug across, and we both noticed. We both smiled, a small, nervous kind of smile. He didn't rush. That was the first thing I realized. He had knocked before sunrise because he needed time, not because he wanted to dump words and run. That alone told me something important. "I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish," he said, staring into his cup. I leaned back, listening the way you do when you know this moment matters. "You don't have to get it perfect," I told him. "Just get it honest." He took a breath, then another, and then he began talking about his life in pieces, not a neat story, but fragments. Work that didn't feel meaningful. A relationship that looked fine from the outside but felt empty on the inside. The pressure to be steady, strong, successful, and the quiet fear that he was pretending more than living. As he spoke, I saw flashes of the boy he'd been. The kid who once asked me why adults always looked so sure even when they weren't. I realized, sitting there in the half-light, that he wasn't asking me to fix anything. He wasn't even asking for advice. He was asking to be seen. I told him things I hadn't planned to say, about my own mornings of doubt, about choices I made because they seemed practical at the time, about how strength sometimes looks like showing up and admitting you're lost. The sun finally crept through the window, touching the table between us. We sat there longer than I can measure, 2 adults connected by blood, memory, and a shared understanding that life doesn't come with a clear map. When he finally stood to leave, he hugged me. Not the quick kind. The kind that says thank you without words. As the door closed behind him, I stayed at the table, hands wrapped around a cold mug, realizing that something quiet but permanent had shifted between us. After he left, the house felt different. Not empty exactly, just quieter in a way that made every small sound noticeable. The refrigerator hummed. The clock kept ticking, stubborn and steady. I stood at the sink watching the morning arrive for real this time, the sky turning pale and ordinary, like nothing important had just happened. I went through the motions of the day, showered, dressed, made the bed, but my mind stayed at that kitchen table, replaying his pauses, the way he searched for words, the way his shoulders finally lowered, as if setting down something heavy he'd been carrying alone. I realized how long it had been since I'd really listened to him without an agenda. When children are young, you listen for danger, for needs, for problems to solve. When they grow up, it's easy to listen only for updates, for proof that they're doing fine. That morning reminded me that listening can be something else entirely. Later that afternoon, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The same streets I'd pushed strollers down years ago. The same houses where birthday parties and graduation photos had happened. Everything looked familiar, but I felt slightly out of step, like I was seeing it all from a new angle. I thought about my own parents, about how little we spoke once I became an adult. They loved me, I know that now, but our conversations stayed safely on the surface. Weather, work, health. No one ever knocked before sunrise to say they were unsure of their life. When my son texted me that evening, it wasn't anything dramatic, just a simple message. Thanks for listening. I didn't realize how much I needed that. I typed back, took courage to come talk. I'm glad you did. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes. Not in him exactly, but in us. Our conversations slowed down. When he called, he didn't rush to fill the silence. When I asked questions, they came from curiosity instead of concern. There was an ease I hadn't felt since he was very young, before expectations crowded everything. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the light fade, he mentioned something from that morning. I almost didn't knock, he said. I stood there for a while. I nodded. I think I knew, I said, even before I opened the door. We sat with that for a moment. The air was cool, the kind that hints at change. I understood then that being a parent doesn't end or stay the same. It shifts. It asks you to grow again, even when you think your growing days are over. That knock before sunrise wasn't about a single conversation. It was an invitation to meet him where he was now, to let go of who I thought he needed to be, and to accept that some of the most meaningful moments arrive quietly, asking only that you open the door. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly and without asking permission. Weeks passed, then months, and the memory of that morning settled into me like a stone at the bottom of a river. Not heavy enough to weigh me down, but always there, shaping the current. My son began stopping by more often. Not long visits. Sometimes just a cup of coffee, sometimes a walk around the block. He never announced a purpose, and I learned not to search for one. We talked about ordinary things. The neighbor's new fence, a movie he'd seen, a recipe I'd nearly mastered. But underneath the ordinary was a new honesty, like a window cracked open. One afternoon, rain caught us by surprise during a walk. We ducked under the old maple tree near the corner, the same one he used to climb as a boy. Water drummed against the leaves, the street empty and shining. You know, he said, hands in his pockets, I always thought you had everything figured out. I laughed softly. I'm still figuring it out. He looked relieved by that, and it struck me how much children, even grown ones, need permission to be uncertain. We stood there longer than necessary, listening to the rain, comfortable in the pause. That night, alone again, I thought about the woman I'd been at different ages. The young mother trying to be strong. The middle-aged woman learning to let go. Now, somewhere in between roles, learning how to stand beside instead of in front. There was grief in that realization, but also freedom. I didn't have to have the answers. I just had to stay present. A few days later, he called late, not urgent, just thoughtful. He talked about a decision he was considering. Not asking what to do, just saying it out loud. I listened, really listened, and when he finished, he exhaled like he'd crossed something off an invisible list. Thanks, Mom, he said, for not telling me what I should do. I smiled into the quiet kitchen. You already know, I said. Sometimes saying it is enough. After we hung up, I sat at the same table where that first conversation had unfolded. The light was different now, evening instead of dawn, but the feeling was familiar. Connection doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it grows through patience, through silence, through the willingness to let another person be exactly where they are. I realized then that the unexpected gift of that morning wasn't just what he shared with me. It was what it gave back to both of us. Trust, renewed and steady, built not on roles or expectations, but on respect. And once that kind of trust takes root, it keeps growing, even when the house is quiet. There are mornings now when I wake before the sun and think of that knock, not because I expect to hear it again, but because it reminds me how quickly life moves from one version of itself to another. How a single moment can quietly redraw the lines between who we were and who we are becoming. My son did make changes, not all at once. Nothing dramatic that would make for a headline, just small, thoughtful steps. A different approach to his work. A few hard conversations he stopped avoiding. A steadiness that came from choosing rather than drifting. I didn't take credit for any of it, and he never offered it. That wasn't the point. What changed most was the space between us. It softened. We didn't cling to the past or rush toward the future. We met in the middle, as two adults learning how to relate without the old scripts. One Sunday morning, months later, we sat at the same kitchen table again. Sunlight filled the room this time, bright and unafraid. He laughed at something I said, really laughed, and I realized how long it had been since I'd heard that sound without worry attached to it. "You know," he said, standing to leave, "I think that morning helped me more than you know." I shook my head. It helped me too. And that was the truth. Being needed in that way, not as a fixer or a guide, but as a witness, changed something in me. It reminded me that motherhood doesn't fade when children grow up. It transforms. It asks for restraint, humility, and trust. After he left, I didn't rush to clean the table. I sat there, hands folded, listening to the quiet. The house no longer felt like something I was left behind in. It felt like a place that had done its work well. As the years move forward, I know there will be other conversations. Some planned, some unexpected, maybe not always easy. But that morning before sunrise taught me something I carry with me now. That love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it knocks softly, waiting to see if you're willing to open the door and listen. And every time I do, I grow a little more into the woman I hope to be. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel.